Thank you very much for the people who wake up and be here, and for the people who are at home. I'm really glad and excited being here in this wonderfully organized conference. Thank you for organizing and bringing me here. Here that music is influenced both by biology and culture. However, the relative contribution of these two factors is not fully understood, and in part because of the issue of biased sample. So most research in music psychology is conducted with participants that are students or online participants or just regular participants recruited from weird Western, industrial, educated, rich, and democratic societies. The issue here is that these populations are extremely biased sample of the human species along critical dimensions, such as spatial and social cognition, as previously shown in other work. So it's very likely that it is biased our understanding of music perception and action. And this means that by testing a limited sample of the human species, we have a limited understanding of things like universality and cross-cultural specificity. Okay, so the solution, one solution is to do cross-cultural comparative research. And this is something I was pursuing in the past few years. And this means simply to recruit participants from diverse backgrounds around the world, from different places, and see and test our assumptions about musical structure and musical perception and musical action. So I've been doing quite a lot of different projects in that perspective, understanding mental representation in audition and music in particular. And few of this research talks about pitch representation and octave equivalence, consonance perception, rhythm perception and production, aesthetic preference of rhythms, as well as the ethics of conducting cross-cultural research. And you can read about us in this citation. But today I'm going to talk about one project that occupies me for the past 6 years. Okay, so what is the issue that come across in many cross-cultural research experiments? Well, verbal instructions. It's going to be a big deal because things can be simply lost in translation. And if we are doing the best, include local people and involve anthropologists and ethnomusicologists, and work very hard for doing controlled experiments and control experiments, and everything is as good as it can, still, people can just small nuanced deviation in the subtle way in which we provide the verbal instruction can completely bias our results and destroy the experiment. So I was really interested in finding ways that don't use words at all. So if you want to understand musical rhythms, we would want something that allows us to characterize in high resolution the mental representation of rhythm in the side of the mind of the participants without relying on words. So something like mind reading. So that's going to be the subject of our talk today. But to do that, we will use something that all of us played as kids. This is the game of telephone. Sometimes they have different names in different places. But I think we all played in this game, right? So what happens in the game? One person says a word, whisper to another person, whisper to another person, and so on. And the fun in the game is even if you start with an obscure word, you end up with a banal word. And why that? Because every single time there's a chance that you're not going to report what you actually heard, but what you think you heard. So as we repeat the game, things become more and more what you think. So the idea to use it in the context of psychology, which is about understanding what people think, is not new. It goes all the way back to Bartlett in the 30s. We did wonderful experiments simply playing this game in very different variations, also paintings and so on. But relatively recently, the group of Tom Griffith realized that this game has a tight link to methods from statistical physics, in particular sampling. And the idea is that this process if you repeat it many times, is associated with something called perceptual priors. And the idea here that, think about words. If we repeat the game multiple times, the chance of a certain word like better to appear is proportional to some kind of mental representation of this word in the mind of our participants. Okay, so that sounds a little bit abstract. So to make it really, really concrete, I'm going to show you what we do in the actual experiment. So in the experiment, there's one single instructions: tap along the rhythm that you hear. Every click you hear, just tap one tap. Okay, and let's do it all together. I'm going to play you a rhythm, and you tap along in your lap or whatever. Let's do it. Okay, great. This is the entire experiment, and you can all do it, right? But there's a little trick. In the actual experiment, we'll take the results of the participant, average them across the repeated pattern, and create a new rhythm that is identical to the reproduction of the participant, just like in the game of broken telephone. Okay? And now the participant will hear a new rhythm. The new rhythm, again, it will synchronize with the new rhythm. Then we'll take the results of the participant, average them, and give it to the same participant again, and again, multiple times. And the participants are not aware to the manipulation. They're really, really shocked when we tell them in the end that they were influenced, the stimulus that they heard. For them, it's just another rhythm. Sometimes they say it's repeated or become easier. We'll talk about it a little bit. But think about it as if they are playing telephone game with themselves. And just like in the telephone game, the idea is every time there's more and more chance that things will be biased towards what they think they hear. So by repeating this game multiple times, we can reveal what they think about. And before I show you the results, I want to talk about the space of rhythm that we investigated. And this is the famous space of 3-interval rhythm. They sound something like that. 4-click, 3 intervals. And this particular rhythm that you heard has 500 milliseconds as the first interval, 500 milliseconds as the second interval, and 1,000 milliseconds as the third interval. And it has a proportion of 1 to 1 to 2, because the third interval is twice as long as the first and second. Okay. And it can be expressed in Western musical notation that way. However, there are other rhythms that cannot be expressed in Western musical notation. For example, a rhythm that the first interval is 434 milliseconds, the second is 536, and the last is 787. However, we can represent every interval, not only integer ratios, as a 3-dimensional space where the x and y and z coordinate are the first and second and third interval, respectively. And that's what we're seeing here on the right and the left on the diagram. And so this rhythm 112 is positioned somewhere in this 3-dimensional space. Now, I choose to work with rhythm that spans a constant duration, that the duration of the entire 3-interval rhythm as, say, 2 seconds. This particular group of intervals are actually a triangle in this space. And now we can rotate this triangle into a 2-dimensional representation. So the exact mathematical details are not important. What's important here is that every point in the triangle represents a rhythm, and every rhythm, as long as it spans a constant duration, can be represented uniquely as a point in the triangle. Okay, so let's get familiarized with the space. So I plotted here the integer ratio durations that are common in Western music. These are the things that we can notate with Western musical notation. And then they are common in both Western and non-Western music. The point is there's an infinite amount of rhythms in between those integer ratio durations. Okay, so to get a little more familiar with the space itself, let's look at this point in the space 112. Okay, now if I play it in kind of an abstract way to sound something like that: 112, 112, 112. 112. This is an abstract rhythm, but in actual music, it will sound something like that. Yeah, jingle bells, jingle all the way. Oh, what fun it is to ride in a one-horse open. What about 332? That's a cooler rhythm. It's common in many types of music, in popular music, in jazz, in an abstract way, but it's actually 3 3 2 3 3 2 3 3 2 1 2 3 1 2 1 2 3 1 2 3 1 2 1 2 3 1 2 3. Okay. Now, how it sounds in actual music, it sounds something like that. Two to three. Well, that's a bit harder to find, especially in Western music. In abstract way, it sounds something like that. Play you this rhythm from here. Yeah, 1 2 1 2 1 2 3 1 2 1 2 1 2 3 1 2 1 2 1 2 3 1. But very common in Balkan music. So here I play you a little bit of Balkan. Okay, so now we're familiarized with the space. Let's go back to the experiment. Critically in the experiments, initially, we pick random points on this triangular space. So it means that we're not particularly a priori thinking about any of these integer ratio numbers. We're just picking a random sample from the triangle. So this is all the samples we picked for one experiment with Boston participant with 26 participants. And you see it's all over, right? And now let's focus on one seed presented to one participant in a particular location of the space. This is what the participant heard. Now I'm going to play what the participant did. And you'll hear ch, ch, ch. This is the stimulus. And you'll hear boom, boom, boom. These are the responses. So it's okay, right? So in fact, the responses of the participants are quite biased from the original stimulus. And you can see it in this triangular representation, that it's not where the original seeds were presented. It's something located in different place in the space. Now the big trick, right? The big trick is we take this response of the participant, make it the new stimulus. So now this becomes a new stimulus, and let's hear what the participant was doing this time. That's a little bit better, but it's still quite biased from the original point. So now that becomes a new stimulus, and we perform another iteration, and then the fourth iteration and the fifth iteration. And you can see that by the fifth iteration, it kind of converged to a particular location in this space. So let's listen to the fifth and final iteration that the participant did. Okay, let's kind of dabble at this point. Okay, so now I'm going to do this again and again for this participant, and again and again and again for multiple participants. And now I'm going to show you the aggregate results over all the participants. And every point in this represents a response of the participant, okay? So initially, as you remember, things are just randomly distributed over the space, uniformly distributed. But this is what happens after 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 5 iterations. Things converge to a particular location in the space. So in order to understand that, we smoothen the distribution with the kernel density estimates, just finding the underlying distribution, and focus on the fifth and final distribution, and get this beautiful picture. The hotspots here in this picture represent high density of responses of the participants, and the blue area represent no responses. And as you can clearly see, there are very, very particular hotspots in this space. What is these hotspots correspond to? Okay, so to help us understand that, I'm going to take this empirical result. This is just participants' responses aggregated for 26 Boston participants. And I'll put there on the integer ratio points that I talked about earlier on, okay, to see the relations. Here are the empirical results of these participants from Boston, and these are integer ratios. Empirical result, integer ratios. Okay, so there's beautiful overlap between the integer ratio that are common in Western music and these responses of those participants who are apparently raised and born on Western music. So for example, this jingle bell pattern, it's very, very strong. and a prominent peak in this distribution. But the 2-2-3 pattern that is common in Balkan music and not in Western music is totally absent from the distribution of those participants. And this is consistent with beautiful work, earlier work in music cognition by Hannon and Trihab, who look at this also in young kids. Okay, so far great, but I'm going to show you something that really, really surprised us. We compared US musicians and non-musicians. And in this room, it's pretty clear that typically we get a lot of differences between musicians and non-musicians. But here, we didn't get a lot of differences. There were just very nuanced differences. And we measure this by this graph that fits a model to the data and picks the weight, the relative importance of the categories. And you can see in the lower graph that the categories for the musicians and non-musicians are quite similar. This means that the non-musician inside their mind have this intricate, balanced distribution of different categories and different weights. And by doing the experiment, we can pull it out of their mind and see it. Now, of course, the musicians were better in performing every single seed, and they had lower noise, as you would expect, in the tapping variability. But the point is that the distribution of category that indicates their mental representation, according to our interpretation, is not different from the non-musicians. Okay, so now we're going to check how that works in a group that have very different exposure. And here I was fortunate to work with the McDermott Lab with the Tsimané. The Tsimané are indigenous population for Bolivia in Amazon, one of the sites that I work. We've been doing their experiments in multiple ways of understanding auditory perception. And there's also a lot of study on the Tsimané in other aspects of perception and cognition. And the question, how the general representation of rhythm will look like with the Tsimané. So here are the US participants' results, and here are the Tsimané. US, Tsimané. Clearly, there's a lot of differences, but I also want to point to some similarities. For example, this jingle bell patterns that we saw here, it's apparent in both groups, and it's pretty prominent. On the other hand, there are certain rhythmic categories with 3-3-2, this jazzy pattern, that is completely absent from the Tsimané distribution, and it's more prominent in the US participants. Now, also, look at this integer ratio. This is this crosses in this diagram, and see that even though there's differences in the weights and the shape of the category, there is an overlap in both groups in terms of the integer ratio categories. It is similar, which is even more, in a way, more apparent that both groups show categorical rhythm, very prominent hotspots and very other blue areas. It's not essential. You could imagine that we'll have a gradient or you have a shady area. We don't see that in these two cultures. Okay, now, interestingly, this results where the 1-1-2 category is pretty prominent is actually consistent with some ethnography that we have. Actually, there's one ethnographic ethnomusicological description of the Tsimané music. It's just from some years ago, so it's not completely updated. But the third thing that they describe in terms of the rhythmic patterns of this music is this 1-1-2 pattern. And this is also something we see in the experiment. This is the ethnography description of the musical structures that they have, what kind of rhythm they have. Up the experiment, I just show you a video of how those iterations converge to the final results and so you see dynamically what happens in the experiment. This is initial seeds. This is what happens after one iteration. And so you quickly already see some of the structure. Now, after 2 iterations, things become clearer and clearer. And this is 4 iteration. And now it's really, really converge in the 5th iteration. Here, we understand that there are evidence for categorical rhythm perception in both cultures. There's lots of cross-cultural variation, a lot of differences. And we're still a little bit unsure about integer ratio because we've seen integer ratio in those 2 cases, but it's not sufficient to say something more broadly because it just two places. Maybe this is something incidental about those two groups that leads to this result. Okay, so before we move forward, I want to give a little bit of sense of the control experiments that are required in order to do this experiment right. So the first question is, okay, this paradigm is cool because we have tapping and everybody can do it and it's intuitive, but it's kind of entangling perception and production in a way that may a little bit hard to interpret if we don't do anything to control for it. So one initial thought we had, and this is where people often say about rhythm that they are embodied. And if they're embodied, they're very much dependent on the body. And according to this view, if this integer ratios might be an artifact or actually a result of kind of embodied aspect of producing the rhythm. So for example, if I tap, my hand oscillates, and oscillation tends to create integer ratio, and this embodied oscillation may explain why we get these integer ratios so strongly. So if this is true, if we change the production modality to a different modality, and particularly to our mouth, where we tend to produce something that is less periodic, which is speaking. So if I use my mouth instead of my hand, then maybe I get rid of these integer ratios altogether and get something very different. Okay, so the control experiment is very simple. People hear the rhythm, and instead of doing tapping with their hand, they just said ta, 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 ta. Okay, now it's a bit embarrassing, so you're not going to do this, but our participants did it, and here are the results. So the triangles up to minor differences are actually pretty similar, and you can see it quantitatively when we measure the category weights. Okay, this is great because tell us that we're really a little bit independent of the production modality, but we're not happy quite yet. We wanted to do something else. And in this case, we use perceptual experiment. Here we rely on the work of others who showed that in categorical perception, and also in, Andy Clark showed it in for rhythm, there is an effect where things in the category boundary, so here in this green to red transitions, are easier to detect than in this category center. So look at two patches in this green to red region versus within the green region. So that manifests the fact that categorical rhythm perception, categorical perception is enhanced in the category boundary. Okay. So what we did is we went between two rhythms and sample them on a number of points. And what we were hoping to see that it is easier to detect differences in the boundary compared with the center of the category. Now, to give you a gist of the experiment, I'll play you two rhythm and you tell me if they're the same or different. So I'll play you ta, 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 little pause and another rhythm and say same or different, okay? Now I play your rhythm more close to the category boundary. For this, you kind of see the effect. Well, two things. It wasn't easy to do this task, right? There was like a little bit of confusion. But the very final one was way easier than the others, right? Because it was right on the category boundary, one leg here, one leg here. Each leg pulls you to a different direction. And perceptually, it's more easy because of this effect. Okay, so this is, we replicated this effect when we tested the experiment. That's what you see on the left, is percent correct as a function of the location. And the category boundary is in the center, and the percent correct, the D prime is better. This is what you see on the right side. But what's cool here is we'll be able to take the results from the participants in the tapping experiment, feed them to a simple ideal observer model that take into account perceptual bias, and predict the results in the separate group of participants who run the discrimination, showing that the computational link with 0 degrees of freedom between one experiment and the other experiment, if you really believe that the source of these perceptual priors and discrimination differences comes from the same source. Okay, there's lots more control experiment in a paper we wrote in 2017. So if you're really interested in that direction, you can have a look in the paper. But I want to move to something more recent and that I'm pretty excited about. And the idea here was to test triangles in different places in the world. And we created a large network of collaborators from everywhere or in many, many places in the world. And we wanted to test different groups in different places, but we also wanted to test within a country, within a location, multiple groups. So we see the difference between students, musicians, non-musicians, dancers, and online participants. And so we had 792 face-to-face sessions. I ran myself in 5 countries. And of course, we had other collaborators who went to different places in the world. And we also had 131 online participants. And here I want to just like a little bit give you a little bit of promotion for a technology that we developed and we applied for the first time in this experiment. And this technology allows us to collect online high quality tapping data. It's something that is challenging because if you use the space bar, it's not going to work because it's not accurate enough. So what we did was we used a solution based on acoustics, participant tapping on their laptop, and we record the responses and do some sophisticated-ish signal processing to separate the channel. And with this, we can collect highly reliable online data, even with this adaptive complex paradigm that I just presented to you. So here are all the triangles we got from the different places in the world. And it's a little bit hard to understand, so I'm going to unpack it a little bit for you. First thing, just eyeball the results and you'd see that there are these hotspots everywhere. So everywhere in the world, we do see that people have perceptual categories in hotspots in particular locations. Okay, that's very cool. The other thing is this crosses here, and maybe I'll zoom out for a couple of them, represent the integer ratio locations. And remember that with the Tsimané only data, we were a little bit unsure whether integer ratios are universal feature or not. So if you eyeball it, it's pretty clear that the integer ratio in all those locations, and actually in every place we tested, overlap with the with the hotspots. And we can quantify that by certain statistical procedure, and it's very, very, very highly significant. So the integer ratio overlap with the hotspots everywhere. A lot of cross-cultural variation. So this is like the extreme sample from this. These are 3 groups from rural participants in China, Mali, and Bolivia. And what you see that the most prominent category in the Chinese participants is 212. However, this category is completely absent from the distribution of the Malian participants, who have the 332 category is the most strongest category. And these 2 categories is completely absent from the distribution of the Bolivian participants. However, everybody seems to have 111, which is the isochronous rhythm, and 112, this is the jingle bell pattern, in all those locations. And this extreme, extremely strong effect of cultural variation, as well as this kind of consistency in other ways, is something we see in all locations. So just to give you an overview of what we're seeing, let's take all those triangles and project them into a space where distances in this space represent pixel distances between the images. So we can kind of overview the entire distribution of images. And this is this multi-dimensional scaling that I'm showing right here. And what I'm focusing now on these blue points that represent the student's response. Interestingly, these students' response are located in particular central area of this diagram and definitely underrepresent the variability that we see in the entire sample. And this is also true for the online participants who also overlap with the students and overlap with this small location in possible space of all options. Sadly, this is exactly what we're testing in most of our research, right? We're testing those participants that are either online participants or students, and they are underrepresent the variability that we see globally. And this is something we have to take care into our research and interpretation. It's also kind of justified to do all this crazy research in different places in the world. The other thing is that the dimension of this space that is coming just from like looking at distances between triangles is really interpretable. So the first dimension that is explained, I think about 50% of the variance, comes from one category. And that category varies a lot and from place to place. And you see that kind of defines the space. The right side contains places with this category, very strong part of the category, and left side represent smaller places. And you see that this category is completely absent, for example, in China. It's very prominent in other places. And what are those places? Well, the places that have 332 are places with some kind of metric rhythm, which is 12/8 rhythm. So these places that happens to be either places from Africa or for Afro-diasporic background are places where we have a prominent 12/8 rhythm. Think about clave in South American music. It contains a 3/3/2 pattern in it. And this is also characteristic for other 12/8 rhythm music in Africa. So basically, this represents something that connects to some kind of musical pattern. Is also a very interesting historical trajectory, connecting places that are far away geographically, but closer in terms of the history and shared history. And you can see it quantitatively by measuring how much 332 we have in these places compared with other places. Now, this is the world record in 332 representations. This is data we collected at the village in Sagele in Mali with my colleague Rainer Pollack. And what's really cool here is that when we asked them to perform their music and recorded their music, this is dancers, mostly female, that just dance together and create music. We recorded their repertoire and discovered about between 25 to 30% of their repertoire contains very, very prominent 3/3/2 rhythm. And I'll just give you an example. So this is a recording we did in the village. Okay, what about 2-3? So remember that we didn't see it in US participants because it's not presumably not present in Western music, but it is present in some kinds of music, in particular music from the Balkan. So we went to Turkey and Bulgaria, tested musicians there, but also it is present in one single place in Africa, or it's pretty rare in Africa, but it is present with the Botswana San. This is a subgroup of participants in Botswana, that they do have 7/8 rhythms, and including this pattern. You see that it's not a huge effect, but these places in particular have very large 2-3 compared presence compared with other places. Now I want to show you something that is also interesting and also points to cultural specificity. This is the presence of complex ratio. So in some places, I'm going to show you, you see this corner, there's a little bit, this is participants from Mali. And what you see that they have relatively large number of this pattern 237. And this is something that you can find in the music, a little pattern. If you listen to the Dundun pattern, it's doing this. And it's very hard for me to do it even. I'm not going to perform you. But the participant consistently doing this. And it's interesting because it's such a highly complex ratio. But because it's present in the music, it's emergent of the data. Finally, we often say that music is linked to language, something we say often. We didn't find any evidence for that in our data. As one example, we found that US and South Korean participants who similar in their musical exposure, but different in their language, radically different, produce very similar results. Also, when we tested things in large cities, for example, in La Paz, this is a big city in Bolivia, when we compared participants who have traditional background to student population from the same city, they showed very different results despite speaking the same language. And in fact, despite being in a large city, which you basically can hear in the music, in the streets, in the buses, all kinds of music. But something initially in this maybe earlier stages of these participants or the cultural experience or engagement generate stark differences, even though they have similar language and overlapping geographies. So to summarize, large cross-cultural differences, student population underrepresent cross-cultural variability, so we need to reconsider how we do research. Distances between groups are interpretable, and they relate to musical features of these, the exposure that the participant had. Simple integer ratios are universally present. Highly complex ratios are possible, in some places at least, and there's no evidence for the influence on language, at least for what we are testing. So this kind of home on the question, when are these representations learned and how they come about? And this is something we've studied in the follow-up questions and used the last minutes to describe this. So this is a follow-up paper looking into the developmental trajectory of these triangles. And we tested over 150 kids now with a multi-lab collaboration with the lab of Laurel Trainer and Erin Hannon. And together they get enough kids so we can get to see the developmental trajectory and the different in the different ages. And so Carly and Ave from the Hannon lab developed like a setup that kids can do.
Welcome to my laboratory under the stars. My name is Estelle, and I'm an astronomer searching for extraterrestrial life.
The idea. So
we are trying to.
Children are very engaged, and this is the result. So this is all the children together, and what you can see is that they basically quite similar to the adults when you compare this quantitatively. Well, a little bit simplified, of course, but overall pretty similar to the adults. And this is in different, just comparison with the cross-cultural differences that we see before, suggesting that kids by the age of 6 to 11, I don't show you the age differences because there's not a lot going on. By 5 or 6, the kids are already similar, more similar to the adults than the cross-cultural variation, suggesting that this process happens at pretty early stage and reflects certain experiences, exposure that happens early on. And this is maybe also why we did not see that much differences between musicians and non-musicians, because they don't differ that much in those early stages that are so critical for the formation of these categories. So a prediction, and very interesting prediction, is to go some places where early on, there's early on differences in prediction, for example, in Mali or Uruguay. And there, the prediction that we'll see bigger cross-cultural differences and dissociation at early ages. Finally, I want to talk about something that I'm really excited about. Is the work in progress. We're collecting now control participants. But the idea here is to test people that never heard rhythm. In this case, are congenitally deaf individuals. And the question is whether they're going to have rhythm representations despite not exposed to rhythm with their ears ever. Now, of course, I was a little bit naive originally when I didn't know how to work with this population, because turns out they have experience with music in the haptic modality, and it's a very important part of their life, and they reported it. We can even see some dissociation between people who report this, or like musicians of congenital deaf, and non-musicians, and so there's some subtle difference between them. But it's still interesting to see what their rhythm categories will look like. And this is what we're seeing here. And this is a very interesting result, because it actually, the difference is larger than we would expect from, this is like, it's a big difference. And in particular, it's with this simpler rhythm that are very more prominent. And you can think about maybe the haptic modality kind of low pass, the stimulus that they get. And so the more complicated, fast rhythm are a little bit downplayed compared with the low, slower rhythm that are pathing. So maybe that is consistent with this. We're still running control participant with the haptic modality, making sure they don't hear. That's pretty difficult, and happy to finish this when it's ready. Okay, so if you're interested to learn more about these projects, you can learn about them from the two papers. One of them is in current biology from some years ago, and the next one is on SciArchive. It's currently in review. And I want to thank everybody who was involved, a lot of collaborators from different places, in particular, Josh McDermott, who was my postdoc supervisor, and then continued working with me when I started my own group. And then different places from the different stations that I have in my academic career that helped a lot. And particularly people from my current group who help with the collection of online data and interpretation of their results. So thank you very much.